Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Okay. My name is Hena and I work as a Senior Research Data Officer within the Research Data Management team, and we are based at University of Essex. My colleague Christine is here to help us today. And just to let you know that this is the last webinar of UK Data Service Introductory Training Series webinars. You can see our past events page on the website if you have missed. The overall aim of this session is to show you the role of informed consent in sharing data within ethical and legal boundaries. I aim to cover the following in this session. In the first section, I will talk you through why to seek consent. This section will focus on introducing the use of informed consent in research. The second part of the session is about how consent can be obtained, covering documentation and methods that are used to obtain consent, and finally, how to manage the obtained consent forms. This is then followed by a section on when consent could be sought during the research process. Some of the important aspects that needs to be considered are also discussed. Final section focuses on sharing with you some of the wordings used in consent forms by the researchers, example consent forms and information sheets. I will finish it off by highlighting some best practice tips and resources that can be very useful for you if you are interested in data sharing. I'll respond to your questions in the end. As I mentioned earlier, the first section is about why we seek consent. So I'm sure that you all are very familiar with what informed consent is. It is the process by which a researcher discloses appropriate information about the research so that a participant may make a voluntary informed choice to accept or refuse to participate in the research. In the research context, consent is obtained to ensure that participants understand what they are signing up to, making participation and research more effective. It also ensures that the research conducted is ethical and compliant with the data protection regulation. So thus, in research context, we need consent for two purposes. Consent for research participation, which is considered as one of the founding principles of research ethics, where it is sought before participation in any research activity and for all participants. It usually involves providing information regarding study purpose, risk, benefits, voluntary participation. However, consent can also be used to comply with the data protection regulation. If a researcher collects, manages, and shares personal data, then consent of the data subject can be used as a legal basis to process this personal information under UK GDPR. In the UK, there is a duty of confidentiality that is based in common law and that occurs where confidential information comes to the knowledge of a person in circumstances where it would be unfair if it were then to be disclosed to others. There are some exceptions when you can disclose information. For example, if participant consents to onward share their personal data, then sharing does not breach duty of confidentiality. Sometimes public interest can override duty of confidentiality. And occasionally, there are instances when you may need to give up data, such as court order. So the best practice is to avoid very specific promises in consent forms. As researchers, we must adhere to data protection requirements when managing or sharing personal data. Personal data is any information related um, to an identified or identifiable natural person. People can be identified directly or indirectly, for example, through name, addresses, postcode, telephone number, or biometric, um, or they could be identified through indirect identifiers such as occupation, geography, unique, or exceptional outliers. So if personal information about people is collected or used in research, then the General Data Protection Regulation, commonly known as GDPR, it does apply. However, data protection legislation only applies to living persons And if you anonymize the data, then it is no more personal data. So the GDPR does not apply. But keep in mind that not all data can be anonymized or de-identified. A bit of background to the GDPR is necessary here. GDPR is the EU-wide data protection legislation that was introduced in 2018 and replaced UK Data Protection Act that was used until that time. However, after Brexit, it is now called the UK GDPR. Currently, UK GDPR and EU GDPR are aligned. They place the same legal obligations on researchers, but in the future, the two pieces of legislation may diverge as the UK has now left the EU. It will therefore be important for researchers to ensure that they gain local support from their university data protection officer when their research project will span across the Europe. So now if the researcher based in the UK collects personal data about people anywhere in the world, or a researcher outside the UK collects personal data on UK citizens, then DPA and UK GDPR applies. However, if the researchers are undertaking research projects which span across the European Union, then the GDPR will also need to be considered and adhered to. The DPA and UK GDPR define six principles that need to be complied with when processing personal data. All personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently. It should be kept to the original purpose. Personal data should only be collected if it is necessary and removed if it is not necessary. Accuracy should always be upheld, and researchers should ensure confidentiality and integrity. There is a misconception that data protection laws, such as GDPR, prohibits data sharing. However, it does not prevent data sharing as long as you approach it in a sensible and proportionate way. In fact, GDPR is useful for research. It legalizes much of the current good practice in research, such as data sharing and archiving. Under the UK GDPR, there are 6 possible grounds for processing personal data, and one of these must be present. These are consent, public interest, legitimate interest, protection of vital interests, legal obligations, and performance of a contract. In the context of research, the first 3, consent, public task, or legitimate interest, are the most applicable grounds for the processing of personal data. However, consent is likely to be the most widely used ground for processing of personal data. I'll be focusing on the first ground, consent, in today's session. If consent is used as a legal basis for the processing of personal data, then there are certain conditions that needs to be met. These are: consent must be freely given, informed, unambiguous, and it should be specific. There should always be a clear affirmative action, and it should be inferred from silence. It should not be inferred from silence, pre-tick boxes, or inactivity. It should mention about right to withdraw. Participants can withdraw their consent for processing personal data. This is different from the right to withdraw from the research. It must be documented, that is, you can record it, whether it is written or oral. If you are dealing with special category data, then there must be an explicit written statement. The next section is about how to seek consent. It includes formats to obtain consent, consent documentation, methods, and record keeping. Consent can be gained in written or oral form. The format of the consent depends on the kind of research. However, it is important that whatever format is used, written or verbal, it should be documented. You need to document how it has been gained, what information has been provided to the participants, and what they have agreed to. Consent can be written or verbal. Both formats have pros and cons. For example, written consent has more solid legal ground. Participants have agreed to disclose confidential information, So that's a more solid legal ground. This is the form that is usually required by ethics committees, and most of all, it offers more protection for researcher as they have written evidence of consent. However, it cannot be used in some instances, such as in illegal activities. On the other hand, verbal consents are best if recorded, but sometimes it is hard to make all issues clear verbally, and most of all, it can pose greater risk for researchers in regard to adequately proving participant consent, or it may scare people from participating and have them think that they cannot withdraw their consent. Typically, written consent documentation includes an information sheet and a consent form signed by the participant. This division allows the background information to be as detailed as necessary while keeping the signature form short and concise. So, an information sheet should cover the following: purpose of the research, what is involved in participating, benefits and risk of participating, procedures for withdrawal, future uses of data such as storage, publishing, archiving, and details of the research, such as funding source, sponsoring institution, name of the project, contact details for researchers, and how to file a complaint. Researchers need to make sure that consent form should use simple language and should allow the participants to clearly respond to points such as they have read and understood information about the project. They have been given the opportunity to ask questions and they voluntarily agrees to participate in the project. They understand that they can withdraw at any time without giving reasons and without any penalty. And it should also mention future uses such as publications, sharing and reuse of the research data, and the signatures and dates of signing for the participants and the researchers should be also there. If personal information is collected, best practice is to provide information about how personal information will be processed and stored and for how long. Procedures for maintaining confidentiality should be also mentioned, whether real names will be used or not, if data will be anonymized, if so, how. It should also state procedures for ensuring ethical use of the data, especially in the context of archiving and reuse. If the GDPR applies, then further information needs to be provided in the consent form, such as the contact details of the data controller. Data controller is the entity that determines the reason for processing personal data. It could be a data protection officer, REO at your organization, or a researcher himself or herself. Consent form should also state who will receive or have access to the personal data. It should also have a clear statement on the rights of the participants, because participants can request to access their data. They may ask for corrections or removal of their personal data. These need to be communicated to the participants. However, you may use some in the information sheet and some in the consent form. So please have a look at UKDS model consent form, where you can find detailed guidance along with the template to get a clear understanding. Different methods can be used to obtain consent. ICO has recommended the following: signing a consent statement on a paper form, ticking an opt-in box on paper or electronically, clicking an opt-in button or link online, selecting from equally prominent yes, no options, or choosing technical settings or preferred dashboard settings, responding to an email requesting consent and answering yes to a clear oral consent request. You can see that all these methods fulfill the conditions that are required for the consent, which are a clear affirmative action. It should not be inferred from silence, pre-ticked boxes, or inactivity. It is essential that researchers are able to demonstrate that data subjects have consented for their personal data to be processed. So records must be kept and used as evidence or for reviewing if and when required. Good record keeping should include following: who consented, when they consented, what they were told at the time, how they consented, have the consent withdrawn, if so, when. Consent can become invalid if there are doubts over whether someone has consented. For example, if a person doesn't realize they have consented, there are no clear records to demonstrate participants have consented, no genuine free choice over whether to opt in was given, or if there was a clear imbalance of power between a researcher and the individual. And it becomes invalid if the consent request was vague or unclear, if pre-ticked opt-in boxes or other methods of default consent were used, the researcher's organization was not specifically named, subjects were not informed about their right to withdraw, subjects cannot easily withdraw consent, or the research purposes or activities that have evolved since the original consent. So you see how important these things are if you are using consent as a legal basis to share personal data. Even from the ethical compliance perspective, these are very useful things to keep in mind. This section focuses on when to seek consent. Obtaining consent for participation in research or for future uses such as publications or for sharing and reuse of data can be a one-off occurrence or an ongoing process. Both approaches have advantages and disadvantages. One-off consent is used for taking part in the research project only once. It is simple and the least hassle to participants, but there are disadvantages such as sometimes research outputs are not known in advance and the participants will not know about all the information they will be contributing to. On the other hand, process consent is requested continuously throughout the research project. It ensures active consent, but it may not get all consent needed before losing contact, and it can be repetitive for participants and they may be annoyed. There are situations where special considerations are needed when seeking consent, such as medical research, internet research, research with Twitter, research with children or people with learning difficulties, but it is beyond the scope of this webinar to go through each of these. However, I have provided a link at the bottom from our website where these have been discussed in detail if you want to go and have a look. Sometimes researchers are faced with the challenges when sharing or archiving data, especially if the data contains personal information and cannot be anonymized. And at the time of data collection, they do not consider obtaining consent for future uses of data, specifically archiving and sharing. In that case, they may consider retrospective consent. However, if participants cannot be traced, depositing the data in a repository will need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis to identify whether it is appropriate to share it or possibly present it to the ethics board for review and decision. The assessment is made based on the risk, benefits, disclosive nature of the data, and etc. Yeah. In addition, sometimes researchers are faced with the challenges when participants ask to withdraw from their consent, withdraw from the research. This is challenging, especially if the data has been collected or archived for future uses. This needs to be considered on a case-to-case basis, but it is best if researchers consider this in advance and provide information about this in the information sheet and consent form. Sometimes there may not be a problem as the personal data is not shared or it may be anonymized, but sometimes in qualitative studies where there are very less participants, it could be very damaging. So researchers can consider for dealing with participants wishing to withdraw, they could seek a meeting to explain to the participant the cost of this to the project, or they could discuss whether some of the data could be kept. For example, if data can be completely anonymized or some part could be kept for sharing purpose. And there are circumstances where no form of consent can be obtained. These situations are exceptional and will need case-by-case review and clear arguments to satisfy the requirements of ethics review boards. And there can be varied reasons why consent is not possible. Limited capacity may prevent a person from being fully informed. Data may have already been collected for another purpose that did not require consent, such as government administrative data. So consent may not be technically feasible in some very large scale projects. And again, you can get all this information in detail on our website. Now I will show you some real examples from the consent forms that depositors or researchers have used to deposit their data with us, just to show you how they focus on the sharing and archiving aspect. I'll let you read this first. I hope you have read the first extract by now. So the first extract focuses on two things: future uses of data and the forms of data used, such as audio recordings, transcripts, and photographs. And you can notice that these three forms of data are mentioned separately. So in this extract, they have addressed the condition of granularity. They discuss, they added the statements for different forms of data, each separately for each of the form. And in the second example, participants are being informed about the future uses, such as a report, content of a website, archiving, reuse by other researchers. And here you can see that they have also been told that they may be contacted again if their personal data or a quote or photograph will be used, and which shows that they have placed an active consent, or there is a process consent. I let you read this as well. So here again, providing information regarding archiving, who will have access to the data and in what conditions. It also states the reuse purpose. I let you read these first. So both of these extracts show how confidentiality can be maintained, how personal data will be stored, who can have access to it, and on what conditions, and where it will be stored. This is an outline of the information sheet used for a real research study deposited with us. The data deposited with us, researchers have provided detailed information to the participants regarding all these issues. They have provided the information regarding the purpose of the study, why they have been invited to take part in the study. Is it necessary for them to take part? What will happen if they take part? What they have to do? They also provide information regarding the risks, benefits, and what they can do if there is a problem. They also discuss the confidentiality. They also provide information regarding the organizing and funding of the research and who has reviewed that project. So here is an example from Health Research Authority. It is a very nice example about a blood donation study. I'm not sure how many of you are health researchers, but this may give you an idea how to present information to the participants. Here they have combined information sheet and consent form in one document. On the title page, they have added consent statements addressing most of the conditions we have gone through. Although it is hard to read, but I have inserted a link on the resource slide so you can you can check later on. So I let you read just the questions because it's too detailed. You can read it later on. So they have added the consent statements on the title page, and then they have provided all the information related to the study in the following pages. Here you can see that they have provide a bit of a background to the purpose of the research here. Why is the study needed? Here they have provided what does taking part in the study involve, why have I've been invited, and then they have listed the eligibility criteria. Do they have to take part? What should I do if I want to take part? So just addressing the whether participation is voluntary, and then describing the process involved in participating in the research. What happens during my next donation visit? So what happens during and after the visit, and in also in the future visits, all the information regarding this, and then what happens in future, and then they have added the benefits and risks in joining the study, and how the information will be kept confidential, and how it is stored. All the information they have just provide detailed information addressing these two issues. And then again, how participants can withdraw if they want to, and how the researchers are going to use their information, and whether participants are able to know their results, and then a little bit of information about organizing and funding the study, funders and organizers, and then ethics approval, and how they can, if there is something goes wrong, what happens in that case, and then the contact information. So that's a very nice example, and you can have an idea how to present all the information to the participants regarding your study and the consent form statements. So this is an extract of the UKDS model consent form. I let you read this first. This section is about taking part in the study. So I just let you read it first. You can see that it has captured several aspects, such as participants have read and understand the information, voluntary participation, withdrawal from the research anytime. It also explains what they have to do, how information is being collected, or if there are any potential risks. This section from the UK Data Service Model Consent Form addresses the use of information in the study. So I let you read it quickly. So it also addresses the confidentiality aspect by asking what can or cannot be shared, who have access to their research data, etc. So this section on the model consent form is about future use and reuse of the information by others. So this section is informing the participants about future use and reuse of the information data, all the information, where the data will be deposited, in which form, whether it is anonymized or if available under restrictions. And just be aware that only add the name of the repository here if you are certain. You may change your mind later on due to any reason. So if you are not certain, you can write here that data will be deposited at a responsible, trusted digital repository. I have added this model consent form on the resource slide so that you can have a look at it later. So ICO has provided a very useful checklist for researchers that can be used when asking for consent. So here you can see that when you ask for consent, this checklist is very useful. I myself have used it in my research during my PhD. So I found it very useful. So that's another part from this checklist. And you can see that that is quite useful. I have added the link to this checklist on the resource slide as well. So some of the best practices is do not collect personal data if it is not essential. Indicate clearly in a consent form where the participant's consent is being asked for processing their personal data and where consent is being asked for taking part in the research. Keep consent forms under constant review. Different forms of consent should be used for different materials, for example, audio recordings or transcripts, recordings or transcripts. It should be as simple as possible and in easy language. Avoid excessive warnings. Indicate the future uses of data. Indicate the steps that will be taken to safeguard anonymity and confidentiality. And remember, consent is not the only ground to process personal data. There are 5 other grounds, but it is the most common used ground. Indicate the steps that will be taken to safeguard. I have just repeated it, I think. GDPR does not apply if data is anonymized. However, remember that it is sometimes not possible to anonymize all data. For example, you can sometimes anonymize transcripts and text, but it may be hard to anonymize images, audio, or video recordings. So in that case, consent is quite useful. So different data sharing consent agreements for different types of research data. So you need to consider that you should use different data sharing consent agreements if you are using different types of research data. So this is I have listed all the resources that could be very useful for you in future. So it does have a UKDS model consent form, example consent forms that are used in real researches, example information sheet, consent for data sharing, and more detailed information regarding consent for data sharing on our website. And then there is a consent form visit by Daria, which I found very useful. It's just an online tool where you just add your where you are asked different forms of questions, and in the end, when you are finished with all the questions, they have prepared a consent form automatically for you. And then the Health Research Authority example I have gone through, and some information regarding regulating access to data, and then a book by our colleague, which is about managing and sharing research data. And it's a very useful resource. So thank you very much. Sorry. Now I'll go through the questions. So someone asked that where they can find the links. The slides show words that appear not clickable from the screen. So I cannot copy into browser either. These slides are going to be uploaded onto our past events page. So you can click on from there. Click the links from there. If consent has been given for data to be shared as open data, does the participant have the right to withdraw this consent? Yes, they still have a right to withdraw at any time. Would the dataset need to be withdrawn even though it has been publicly available? And this might violate agreements with organizations who issued datasets. You can always, participants does have a right to withdraw, not to withdraw from the consent, but they have a right to withdraw from their data. So you can always have a discussion with your participants whether you can do it or not, but they, under the GDPR, they do have a right to withdraw from their research data. And you can have a meeting with them, you can explain them that this is problematic and what problems it can cause. That's why it's always good to explain or to provide as much information as possible to the participants. Someone asked that I obtained consent for a project and now I want to publish a study, open access, and the journal requires the data. This data is anonymized. Should I re-establish consent from an ethical perspective? If you are fully sure that data is anonymized, there is no risk of disclosure, then you do not need consent. Because I have just gone through that you do not need consent as a legal base to process personal data if your data is anonymized. And if you are fully sure that there is no risk of disclosure, then you do not need to obtain consent, either from a legal perspective or ethical perspective. And these are my contact details where you can contact me anytime with any project related questions anytime.